Okay, guys, I'm gonna walk you through the steps of throwing a foot onto the bottom of your plate. Some things you'll need in order to do this are the bowl or form that you draped your plate over, um, as well as a coil that I would say shoot for something about the thickness of the slab that you use to make the plate itself. A bucket of water, a sponge, and a needle tool. So first thing I did was I attached my bowl to my Giffen grip here. So I just tightened this enough to make sure that this bowl isn't wobbling around as I spin it, okay? The next thing I want to do is make sure that this is perfectly centered on top of the bowl, okay? So if I set this down, and I'm just going to gently spin it, okay, because I don't want this to fly off while I'm figuring out whether it's centered or not, okay? And you can probably see pretty clearly that this is just slightly off center. But if you need to double check, what I do is I'll use my needle tool and I'll just hold it down gently to the clay, which when I stop it, I can see that circle and how far to one of these four sides that circle is, okay? And what I'm seeing now, I'll turn the wheel so that you guys can hopefully see too. What I'm seeing right now is that circle I just created is much closer to this edge and to this edge than it is over here to this edge and to this edge, okay? So what I want to do is I want to pick that up and just shift it over a little bit. Okay, I'll spin the wheel again and I'll just kind of use my finger to smooth out that circle so I don't get confused when I go to do this again. You're not spinning the wheel super fast at this point, you're just spinning it gently enough to get it centered where you need it, then we'll lock it down, okay? So I've shifted it over, I'm just gonna use my needle tool again, very gently. Hold my needle tool to the back, and again check, okay? It's a little close to this edge, a little close to this edge. I could probably shift it further this way to get that circle to come closer to this edge and this edge. You might have to do this about 4 or 5 times just to make sure that it really is close to the center. Otherwise, once you throw that foot on and you go to take the plate off, it'll sit kind of lopsided. Oh, but I'm looking at that now, and it looks to be about the same distance from the circle to the edge here, 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 and here. So that's where I'm going to leave it. And then I'm just going to take some clay. And I'm going to lock that down. So don't press too hard on the edges of the plate, but just enough to get that clay holding on to the edge, and then really push it onto the bowl so it locks it in place, okay? And then take some more clay and do these 2 edges. And be careful as you're doing this not to shift your plate in any one direction. You just got it centered, you want to keep it there, okay? Now this circle that you made to figure out if the plate is centered or not might be the circle that you want to use to end up throwing your foot on directly onto. You can make it a little bit wider or you can make it a little bit more narrow. Just keep in mind that too narrow and the base will not be extremely sturdy. You might have a little bit of a wobble, or when you go to set things in your dish, you might, if you put too much in it and that foot isn't wide enough, it's not going to keep that dish upright. It might tip from side to side, okay? So I wouldn't make the diameter of your foot any less than about, I'd say 2 inches, okay? You wanna give yourself a fairly sturdy foot for this, okay? I kind of like the circle that I just made to figure out where my center is. So I'm actually going to use that. That line will be the outer edge of my foot. But I want to spin it, and I want to use my needle tool to add just a little more pressure. Oops, I lost one of my blocking pieces of clay. I'm just going to score right on the inside of that circle, about 3/8 to 1/2 inch thick, okay? And that's where I'm gonna attach my my coil to throw my foot. Let me find my little piece of clay. There it is. Okay. Take your Okay, so make sure you've scored your coil. And then we're gonna add a little bit of water to both this area that I scored on the plate and some water here. Don't need to get it sopping wet, just a little bit of water so that when you go back over it to score, you're kind of creating that slip right on the surface. And just go over those score marks a little bit more here. Okay, so that way you don't have to deal with actually brushing on any slip. You're just creating that slip right there, ready for attachment. Okay, so now I'm just going to take my coil and give it some good pinching pressure. And you're going to squeeze that down onto that scored area. Make sure both sides that are scored are connecting together. Okay, and I like to give it just a little bit of an overlap right there at the end where that coil connects back in, and then I'm just going to slice through both of those. Just kind of pick that end of that coil up and get that little bit of clay out from underneath it. And then your coil should meet pretty perfectly right there at that joint. I'm going to use some of that clay to pull nicely over that seam. But try not to pinch it too much because you don't want to pinch it thinner than the rest of it. Otherwise, it'll be a little awkward when you're cleaning it up in this next step. Okay. So just to give you a better view of what that looks like. So that's well attached. You can see some of the slip is kind of squeezing out from that connection. Make sure, maybe give it a little wiggle. Just make sure that everything is well attached. All right. Make sure that these pieces of clay are still holding everything down. Add a little bit of water right here just to get a better connection. This clay started off a little on the dry side, so you might want to use slightly wetter clay. Okay. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get a little bit of water in my sponge and just squeeze it right onto the inside of that coil. Okay, and then you can use that water to sort of pull over the coil and onto the outside. And I'm going to add a little more pressure. I'm just using my fingers right now. Okay, so I'm kind of using my index and my thumb finger to hold gently over that coil. You guys can see that. Okay, you're working between 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock. Okay, so right over here on this side. So I'm holding that coil in place. I'm using my middle or index finger on my other hand, and I'm just giving it a little bit of pressure down. So we're getting it well connected, even more so than we already did by scoring and slipping. Okay, I'm paying close attention to that inside seam right there. Okay, that connection point on the inside as well as the connection point on the outside. So I want to really ensure that that coil is stuck down nicely. If you feel like your clay is getting a little dry, your fingers are dragging on that clay, get a little more water in your sponge and squeeze that water just right inside that coil. right? So once you've pushed that seam together, you really shouldn't see any separation between this clay you just added and the surface of the plate, okay? Both inside and outside. So double check, make sure you don't see any kind of seam or separation between the two pieces of clay. And then I'm just going to use a little pressure to kind of give it a small pull. So that foot is actually getting a little bit taller, a little bit skinnier. Okay. It might actually even be a little too tall. So if that's the case, you can trim it down. All right. Remember to use your needle tool to just slowly come in from the outside and pull that ring of clay off. Guiding it in until it touches my finger, and then just popping it right off. Okay. So that's what came off of there. And I'm just going to use some water and my fingers again to clean that foot up. That also, if you had a few lumps and bumps in that coil when you attached it, what that cutting that off will do is help level it out. Okay. All right, so at that point, your foot should be nice and well attached, cleaned up. You can take these pieces of clay off. Some of it got a little stuck on there. That's an easy fix. You can either pull that off with your finger or you can just trim that right off if that happens, okay? And then you can just take your sponge and go around and clean up any slip that might have gotten left behind. All right, now I don't want to immediately turn this right side up and set it down on its foot because this is pretty sticky clay at this point. So leave it alone, let it set up a little bit, and then you can flip it over and begin to brush your underglaze on for the Sgraffito step.